This morning I told you that there's never anything on Channel 37. Now, you may be wondering, what is Channel 37 if you grew up without TV channels? Of course, nowadays, you have 500 channels and there's not anything on, but back in the day, you used to have to tune in your TV to a specific channel to watch it. And those could range from anywhere from the lower band and from 3 to 18, the UHF band that went even higher. But if you ever got around Channel 37, there would never be anything on that signal. And there's one reason for it: interference. Specifically, interference with a radio telescope. See, scientists have a telescope that they use to explore the universe that doesn't look through a lens, but rather collects radio waves from space that give indicators of planets and stars and all kinds of cosmic phenomena. And of course, it has to be very sensitive to do that. And they're usually found in very remote locations. But they scan on a frequency that is equivalent to Channel 37. And if there was anything that was put over those airways, it would completely destroy the use of that scientific equipment. So the government's decided to ban anything from ever being on Channel 37. That's why there's nothing on Channel 37, because it would interfere with something else. A lot of things get interrupted by interference. A lot of messages never get out. You get nothing but a static screen because of interference. George Bernard Shaw said it this way: the biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it has taken place. You see, when we think about how we communicate with one another, when we think about how we talk to other people, we need to consider our communication. Especially as we try to lead people to Christ, as we try to lead people to better things, communication is of absolute essential. Let me read to you what my friend and preacher Andy Baker once wrote in an article. He said, "One of the chief sources of problems and difficulties that we most regularly deal with in our lives comes from communication, the lack thereof, and the misunderstanding thereof. Marriages fail because husbands and wives stop communicating, and if they do communicate, they do it in the wrong way, or they misunderstand each other to the point of assuming and behaving as individuals instead of the one flesh as God intended. Issues with communication can happen anywhere, in any situation, even in the church. As one preacher said, tongue-in-cheek, of his congregation that he worked with, their unofficial motto was, 'Communication is overrated.' One can sympathize. Programs might be offered, assumptions may be made, parties might be excluded, feelings are neglected and hurt, suspicions arise, divisions are created, the work of Christ stalls. Why? Chiefly sometimes because of the failure to communicate." Communication isn't overrated, it is vital. Any relationship between two people requires us to consider how we communicate with one another and how we speak to one another. And when it comes to leadership, whether it's in the home, in the school, in the workplace, wherever we find ourselves trying to help and lead other people, we must understand the vital importance of communication. In Colossians chapter 4 and verses 4 through 6, Paul there asked the people there to pray for him that he may make clear the way I ought to speak. "Conduct yourself with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Let your speech always be with grace, as though seasoned with salt, so that you may know how to respond to each person." As he coveted his people's prayers so that he'd know how to speak, notice in this passage, not only does he talk about saying the right thing, but saying it at the right time, making the most of that opportunity. Saying it in the right way. Let your speech be seasoned with salt. Saying it with the right emphasis to say the right thing. You see, communication isn't just in what we say, and it isn't just saying something. Sometimes we think, well, I spoke, therefore I communicated. But there's a difference. Communication is different. And tonight I want to look at some C's of communication so you can remember them. What are some C's that we need to think of when we think about good communication? Well, good communication is considered. You must remember the importance of choosing words rightly. Communication isn't just blurting the first thing that comes to mind, but rather considering what to say and how to say it. Mark Twain once said, the difference between the right word and the almost right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. Saying something with the wrong word can say something entirely different. It can make people think something entirely different. It can communicate an entirely different message. That's why we must consider how to respond. In Proverbs 15:28, it says, the heart of the righteous ponders how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours out evil things. Do you see the contrast there? The righteous man ponders, he thinks, he considers before he gives an answer. But the foolish, the wicked man, just lets it all pour out. How many times have we regretted something that we said because we didn't consider our communication? We didn't consider what we were saying. We didn't consider how it would be perceived. Good communication is always considered. Good communication is always concise. You must consider the effectiveness of brevity. As one author said, some people seemingly sail around the word with verbiage when they only need to cross the creek. Sometimes in our effort to say something, we oversay it. We say more than is necessary. We say more than we intend to. Maybe it's because we feel like we have to say something. Plato was quoted as saying, wise men speak because they have something to say, fools because they have to say something. You see, there's a difference. There's a difference between just saying something and saying something of use. And that's why as we consider our words, we need to consider the length of them. Ecclesiastes 6:11 says, where there are many words, when there are many words which increase futility, what is an advantage to a man? The more words sometimes doesn't help us along any. As one preacher was given the advice about his lesson, they said, start with a very clear, good, strong opening and finish with a very good, clear, strong close. And in between those, try to make them as close together as possible. Saying more isn't always saying more. We need to make sure that when we say something, we are saying it in what is necessary and needed. Ephesians 4:29 says, let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, only such a word that is good for edification, according to the needs of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear. There's a lot in that passage, but I wanted you to consider one part of it, according to the needs of the moment. You see, there are things that you can say, but when you say them, they may not do much good. They may cause more confusion than help. That's when we consider our concise nature of our speech. Saying more doesn't really help because it's not needed. We can go on, but it loses something because the message gets drowned out in all the words. That's why good communication is concise. But good communication is also clear. We must give thought to the importance of how something is expressed. Years ago, I understood the sentiment if somebody said that there's a great need for a sarcasm font. How many times do you say something and you mean it sarcastically and somebody reads it and thinks it's literally and they take it completely wrong? I think that I'm a fundamental believer. That's why emojis got started with texting, because you needed to be able to send something that was just like, I'm just kidding, or smiley, or whatever, because people would read it and see it the wrong way. Because that form of communication, it leaves something out. It's not clear. Maybe because we can't see a face, we don't understand it. Maybe because it's said in a place or a way that people don't catch the message. You know, press departments do this all the time. They'll release information that could be bad against them on a Friday afternoon late in the news cycle. You know why? because everybody at the paper is ready to go home, right? All the news will ignore it because they've already got their stories prepped for the weekend. They call it the Friday news dump, because they know no one's paying attention at that moment, so they can release something bad and say, well, we said it, but nobody heard it because it wasn't clear when they did it. It's how we say something. It works in lots of ways. Proverbs 15:1 says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. You see, it's how we say that, a gentle answer. It can change everything. But the reverse is true. We can say something in the wrong spirit, in a harsh way, and even though we may be trying to calm the situation, we're really just throwing fuel on the fire. That's why Paul tells Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4:16, pay close attention to yourself and your teaching. Preserve in these things, and this you will ensure the salvation for both yourself and those who hear you. Pay close attention to yourself and your teaching. Think about what you're saying, Timothy, and think about how you're saying it. Think about what you're doing when you're saying it. Think about when you are saying it. Because if you do it the right way, it may ensure salvation for both yourself and those who hear you. For us, it works the same way. You know, a statement said at the right time can change someone's perspective. If we're very clear in what we say, it can be a great encouragement. But the opposite is true as well. You say something to somebody at the wrong time, you may have all the best intentions in the world, but it'll come off in a completely different way. That's why good communication has to be clear. We need to think about how it is expressed. But good communication is also clarified. Don't forget the importance of clarification. You know, we use the phrase, something is as clear as a bell, right? But how come they ring a bell more than once? How come you hear a siren, but how come they do it more than once? Because the first time you hear it, you go, what was that? You ever hear that? The tornado sirens go off, and you think, what was that? Then you hear it again, go, I think that's the sirens. It takes you a couple of times before you hear it, you get what it is. Even though the message was clear, you may not have understood it the first time. That's why clarification, restating, is important. You can't say something once and expect that to be the end all and be all of something. You know, we do that when we think about how we might invite someone to services. Well, ask them one time, and they didn't come. Well, maybe we need to do it again and again and again, because that clarification can be helpful. That clarification can show that we really truly care if they come. Well, ask me the first time, I just want to see if you do it again, if you really meant it. That's why it's important that we clarify message. You know, we see that in Scripture. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 1, Paul writes, finally, my brethren, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things again to you is no trouble to me and is a safeguard to you. How many times in Philippians does Paul say rejoice? Over and over and over. Why? Because he wanted them to get that message. He thought that message was important enough that he was going to keep hitting that same bell over and over. This is different than just having one communication that's overly worded. That's what we were talking about earlier. This is making sure that important messages are emphasized. We say things and we emphasize them. This is important as parents to your children, that they see certain things, that message is clear and it's clarified and it's shown over and over again, because that's how it gets in their heads. Peter would say in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verses 12 and 13, therefore I have always be ready to remind you of these things, even though you already know them, and have been established in the truth which is present with you. I consider it my right, as long as I am in this earthly dwelling, to stir you up by way of reminder. I kind of like this passage because Peter is telling a preacher, you can preach the same thing again and again. Why? Because people need to hear it again and again. People may need to have it emphasized again and again. Certain principles have to be clarified. That's why it's important in our communication. We need to make sure that We're not afraid to keep communicating. Once we say something, we need to say it again. We need to emphasize that continually until we no longer want it to be done. You know, you tell your wife you love her once, well, you might need to tell her again and again, even though she already knows it. That's the power of a clarified communication. Though precise words are chosen and expressed artfully, a lack of understanding on the recipient can still persist. Clarification is an effective means to ensure full understanding. Because it's not always what you said, it's what they heard. How many times do we see that as the hindrance when it comes to communication? We think we said something, they think they heard something, and they're two totally different things. And until that message is repeated and reverberated, well, can we make sure that everyone is hearing and saying what they intended? Good communication is also consistent. Consistent in the message and consistent in the man. A consistent message is one that you hear and you hear again, and it's the same message. It's one that you hear and you see acted out. That is consistency when it comes to a message. Paul would write to Titus about those, he said, that profess to know God, but by their deeds deny Him. In other words, they had a message that was clear. It may even be clarified, repeated, but it didn't fit with their life. And so that message was not received. If you tell someone something and they see that you don't mean it, well, then that message is washed away like a writing in the sand on a beach. It's gone immediately. That's why good communication is consistent. When things don't go together, it bugs us, right? When things don't fit together, it causes us problems. And that works the same way in message. And that's why sometimes you get negative reactions to messages. People say things and people instantly get upset with them. Let me prove it to you. You pick up your phone or you call somebody in, they put you on hold, and while you're sitting there listening for a while, it comes up and says, our call is very important to you. When you hear that, you go, you know what? I'm glad I'm going to stay on this line a little bit longer. No, you don't. You get mad. Why? Because you say, I know it's not important to you, because if it was, you'd be talking to me, right? If it was, you'd have picked up. That message is there, but it's not consistent with what you're experiencing at the moment. That's why good messages must be consistent. It's the thing we see about God's word, isn't it? It's consistent. 2 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 18, he says, God is faithful, and our word to you is not yes and no. Sometimes we communicate to people poorly because our message is yes and no. Our words are yes, our actions are no. Our words are no, our actions are yes. Our message is one thing, but we don't really follow through on it, so we think, well, we didn't really mean that. We say we're going to do something, and then we don't do it, and so everybody says, well, we didn't really want to plan to do it. That's why good communication must be consistent. Even when you don't talk, you communicate. You can say a lot of things without saying anything. That's the power of communication. Back in the Cold War, if you lived in the Soviet Union or one of its satellite states, you were on a planned economy. What that basically meant is whatever goods were created and services were provided were set by the government. They determined the production, they determined what was going to be produced, and they determined what you were going to get. You didn't get much choice. And so there wasn't much need to advertise any product. If times were good, you might be able to go in and get exactly what they're told you. If times were bad, well, you might have to wait in the line and you get what you get. And life in the Soviet Union was a lot of times waiting in line for something you didn't really want. So there wasn't much need to advertise products like we think of in the United States. Today, if you want to sell more things, you advertise, right? It's a $60 billion industry. There was over $60 billion on television alone in 2022. What do those ads do? They show you a product, they show you a service in hopes that they can sell you more of it. But what need was there something like that in the Soviet Union? Except there were. The Soviet Union's planned economy still had advertising. But the advertising wasn't all that important, you would think, because they had no choice. But the truth of the matter is the advertising was much more about trying to sell the people that their life was good than it really was about providing something. So the Soviet Union had ad agencies that produced ads for products that weren't even available and sometimes not even real. And they would run on Soviet television. Why? They wanted to make the Soviet life look great and look fantastic. Now, I'll let you go home and look up some of these ads to tell you if you think that they work. They are some of the weirdest things you will ever see. One of the more famous ones was just pictures of chickens and meat being processed that just said minced chicken over and over and over in Russian. I know that probably wouldn't sell very well in America, but the Russians actually loved the ads, not because they believed them, but they just thought they were entertaining and weird enough to catch their attention, because they knew what actually was happening in their lives. No matter how much the message came up and said, everything's great, they knew what the life was like. They knew the difficulties they faced. They knew what it was like to live under communist rule. No matter how long you sent a message, didn't really have any meaning. What about us? Are we doing the same thing today? Are we communicating a message that no one really believes because they know and see the truth? Are we communicating the truth, or are we just trying to sell what we think people want to believe? Are we truly living our message? Are we truly emphasizing our message? Are we truly holding to the truth? Are we truly doing the best we can to communicate the most important things? If the gospel message is so important, why are we not considering how we spread it? How are we making sure that we're saying the right things in the right ways? If Christ Church is so important to us, why are we not being clear of the place it is in our lives? Why are we not showing it every day in how we follow Him? Why is our message something different than our lives? Because I said we communicate in a lot of different ways. It's what we say to people. It's what we show people and how we live. We may be putting a message out there, but it isn't a message people believe because they look at us and say, this is someone that I can follow to find the Lord. Or do they look at us and just kind of laugh and say how odd it is to have something that doesn't really exist? That's why we need to consider our communication. We need to consider what we say and how we say it, and how we emphasize it with our lives. If we say that Jesus is our Lord, then why haven't we obeyed His truth? If we say heaven is the place that we want to be, then how come we haven't done something to ensure that will be our eternal home? What message are we sending the people around us? Are we truly His? Do we believe and follow Him completely? Or do we live our lives in a contradictory way, still in sin, yet claiming to follow Christ? Maybe today you need to put your life right. You need to clarify your message and show that what you say you believe is truly what you believe. Maybe it's time to say something. Maybe you've never confessed Jesus as your Lord. You've never put on Him in baptism. Maybe you're not living in a life in a way that's in accordance with the principles that you once said. Are we holding to our good confession? Are we living up to the message? Today, if you find yourself wanting and need to respond to the invitation we offer to you right now while we stand and sing.